roll call this time just because last time we used up some of our precious time before the program crashed. So I see here we have Mr. Rivera, Mr. Constant, Ms. Zalatel, myself. Are there any other assembly members on the line? Okay, if there's any other assembly members, please take yourself off mute. Desiree, is there anyone in the lobby or anything equivalent to that?
I am admitting people as they pop up.
All right, we'll wait a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Desiree, are the call-in numbers the same as they were this morning?
The number is the same, but the conference ID is different.
Okay.
And I believe I sent that out to everybody yesterday.
Okay, well, please just monitor your email in case someone reaches out.
Yes.
All right. Call this work session to order. Actually, I'm going to contradict myself and ask for attendance. Let's see. Yeah, Ms. Camacho, could you please do a quick roll call of the assembly members?
Sure thing. Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dyson. Nothing. Miss Kennedy.
Here.
Perfect. Miss LaFrance, is she still excused?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Perfect. Miss Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Perfect. Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Miss Zalatel. I see Miss Zalatel on the attendance list, so I'm sure she's here. Mr. Weddleton. And Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Okay, so we've got everybody but Mr. Dyson. Miss LaFrance is excused, Mr. Perez-Verdia is not on, and Mr. Weddleton is not on. That might be someone.
Okay. All right, well, we'll get started. For those of us that were here this morning when we had the crash, apparently it was a muni-wide or even perhaps a nationwide crash, and so it wasn't something on our end. Still, I think it highlights certain weaknesses with this program. Unlike other entities, we can't just reschedule our meeting. It takes 48 hours to do a work session. So we will be looking for other alternatives, probably to Microsoft Teams, to ensure that we don't have something like that happen again. And then we'll be rescheduling the work session that was going to happen this morning. We'll be rescheduling that for Monday. And we hope to get an email out about that soon once we figured out exactly how we're going to do that. With that, So we asked, or I asked the administration to present the resolution that would extend, or if we pass it, will extend the mayor's emergency declaration. They emailed that out or they gave it to us to email out just about 45 minutes ago. So folks should have it in their inboxes. If anybody doesn't have it, please shoot me a text and we'll get it to you. If you want to ask a question, same as we've been doing, please send me a text or use the chat function here. With that, who from the administration will be presenting on this resolution?
Ms. Vogel should be presenting.
Okay. So Ms. Vogel, would you like to run us through the resolution, please?
Yes. So the resolution itself has a lot of similar language to the first extension. So it's sort of word for word in the whereases through the entire first page, and sort of quoting what was in that proclamation of emergency itself. On the second page, we get into a little bit of an update, and I would imagine that on Tuesday we would submit a floor amendment to update with the number of confirmed cases and deaths that we have. I put in for Alaskans, obviously in terms of sort of marking what the moment means, we could also add in municipal specific facts. And then just sort of talking about what the models show, and models which have been shared with the community as a whole show that the spread and death toll of this virus would be much higher without the emergency response efforts undertaken so far. And those include social distancing. I mean, a lot of the models show social distancing as one concept, that's sort of social distancing light, and then a Wuhan style lockdown as, another extreme, and then what we're doing as something significantly more than just giving guidance to socially distance ourselves. So the hunker down order combined with the state mandates that limit travel. And the collective total of our various emergency orders on the municipal and state level are responsible for slowing the spread. But those same models, and some of the test results that we're getting back, including the percentage of positives that we're getting. And I'm obviously not a medical professional myself, so there are other people who can speak to this better than I can, and are regularly speaking to this better than I can. But we wanted to capture here that the fact that we're still getting a percentage of our positive of tests that we're sending out as positive, and it's a higher percentage this week than last week, is an indication that we're not yet on the slowing down side necessarily of this. In fact, there are models that indicate that we haven't yet hit our peak. And so putting those facts into here, but acknowledging that the full extent and effect of COVID-19 cannot yet be known. And for those reasons, sort of where we're at now, the fact that we're in the position that we're in and not a worse position because of our emergency declaration, the administration is asking for an extension. I don't think the extension itself really comes as a surprise to anyone, but then we did need to think about what date to ask for, and we wanted to do a couple things with the messaging on that. The first is none of our individual emergency orders go beyond the date of an emergency, and so any of the latest extensions that we've had for an individual emergency order, hunker down order, for example, couldn't have extended beyond April 14th, which is the date that the last assembly's extension of this emergency expires. As a result, when we think about what date should apply to the emergency proclamation as a whole, realize that it does then limit the ability that we have to message out how long all the other measures are going to be in place for. That said, we often historically have made individual orders have a shorter expiration date than the emergency as a whole. And you can see that with a number of the orders issued since the emergency proclamation here, where Hunker Down was originally only going until March 31st, and the restaurant closure similarly only going to March 31st, whereas I think the PPE preservation one went all the way to the end of the emergency. So it's just sort of, some of that is signaling when we're thinking about what the end of the emergency should be. Here, our proposal is to match it to the state's declaration of emergency, which extends until November 15th, 2020. As you all, as the assembly members on this call are aware, Anchorage Municipal Code 380.080 allows the assembly to terminate an emergency proclamation at any time, and additionally terminate specific emergency orders or emergency regulations at any time. So we're asking for, or we're proposing November 15th, 2020, with the understanding that individual emergency orders would have, many of them may have expiration dates built into them that are shorter, and that anything that has gone on too long, whether it's the emergency as a whole or emergency orders or emergency regulations specifically, can be terminated early. And so that's how we get to the resolved part of this, which extends the emergency through Sunday, November 15th, 2020. And it contains the same requirement about reporting that the assembly asked for in the last emergency extension.
Kate, we have two questions here. First, Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, I guess I got a little bit confused with emergency orders versus the emergency proclamation. So the question is, do the current emergency orders remain in place with the extension of the emergency declaration?
Yeah.
Not by it, through the chair, Ms. Zolotel, not by itself. The emergency orders would need to be separately reissued because of how they were drafted. They were drafted with an expiration date. If they'd been drafted separately, that says, for example, through the amount of time, until the emergency is declared over, right? Then extending the emergency proclamation would sort of automatically extend those orders, but that's not how those were drafted.
So may I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So is the intent then also to have us extend the emergency orders, or a request for us to extend emergency orders in addition to the proclamation?
No, the intent is that so long as this passed before those expired, that the mayor would then issue emergency orders with new deadlines within them, but not, in other words, extending the existing ones with new deadlines, but not to this whole November 15th date. Most likely, I assume some of them might, like the bag one might extend all the way to the end of the emergency, but Hunker Down, I don't think is being contemplated to extend anything close to that far out based on the information that we have right now.
And may I ask one last follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Thank you. Do you know if there is any contemplation of also significantly editing the substance of the emergency orders if they are extended, if we extend that proclamation?
Through the chair, unless someone else wants to answer this one, we've heard from assembly members about desires to go both ways on the Hunker Down order specifically, with some individuals wanting to loosen it up and expand what non-critical businesses can do, and other members interested in locking down further. my understanding is that there's not a strong desire by the administration to move in either of those directions right now, although we're constantly refining based on information that we're getting from medical providers and models about where the disease is going.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just for clarity, you're using the term emergency order, but am I mistaken that it's executive orders, right? We have an emergency declaration and then you have executive orders. Is the hunker down an emergency order or is it an executive order?
So we have titled them emergency orders. They do come from the executive. So I guess executive emergency orders is how we've thought. I mean, they're entitled emergency orders. And it comes from the charter, which says that the administration can issue such other orders as necessary in an emergency, and from our code, which talks about issuing, gives the mayor the power to issue other orders as necessary. So that's how we've titled them, emergency order. So yes, we are thinking of ones that are coming from the executive.
Okay.
And I did want to say, of course, we're going to be happy to modify hunker down based on sort of new information as it comes to us. We're really trying to pay attention quite closely. And if someone could hit mute if they're not talking, because there's getting to be a little bit of feedback on the line. Thank
you. Ms. Quinn Davidson, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks, Kate, for running through this. So this is 7 more months, and I understand that the state did it, but it's not clear to me, and I'm just sort of skimming through it since we just received this, but it's not really clear to me why November 15th. And I think if a constituent were to ask, I would just say, oh, we're doing that because the state's doing it and because there's some modeling. I don't know what that modeling is. We haven't had a presentation from public health people, and I feel really uncomfortable just moving forward with us without having more content about why we would be doing it for that length of time.
Is there someone from the administration in particular you'd like to answer, Austin?
And I guess this is Austin again. I'll just add that, you know, we, like you, have been getting a lot of feedback from the public, and I'm not suggesting that what we've been doing has not been the right course, but I think we need to be really equipped to respond as to why we're making the decisions we're making. And this is a big chunk of time. And so I think we just need a lot more information.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, who is that?
This is Jason. If I could just respond really quickly. I mean, I think the easiest answer to why we chose November 15th is consistency with the state. I think that there is obviously a lot of confusion from folks that are out there in the community about how long is this going to go on. And from our perspective, having a certain amount of consistency with the state will hopefully lessen some of that confusion by if we chose a date that the emergency proclamation was going to end on June 23rd and they still have November 15th, as we get closer to that date, people are going to be confused if the state hasn't changed theirs, but we get closer to ours. So that was the reason why we chose November 15th, was just to be consistent with what the state did.
So I have a couple people in the queue, but I'm going to ask my own question. To what degree was the state's setting it November 15th motivated by the fact that they have a part-time legislature that is much more difficult to call back into session and to sort of congregate? So they were leaving Juneau. They knew they weren't going to come back anytime soon, and so they set it out in the deep into the future. But we have a full-time legislative body. So to what degree was their decision motivated by the fact that they have a part-time legislature?
I think that's a great question, and my understanding is that did play a certain role in that they are only part-time, and if all of a sudden they have certain members that need to be quarantined, or they don't have the ability to get to Juneau or meet somewhere outside of Juneau, I think that certainly played a role. But I think our position still would be the same regardless, is that We didn't want to have differing dates out there for the public to be potentially confused by.
Thank you. I have a couple people in the queue, starting with Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I appreciate the comment about the comparison between the state and the municipality. And I think that's one of my questions is I really am not familiar with exactly what kind of provisions the state declaration of emergency gives the governor compared to what ours gives to a mayor. And it seems to me that we have a lot more power given to the mayor to do certain things that the assembly would normally be more involved in, but under a declaration, we are less involved. And the first thing that comes to mind is just the idea of having no bid contracts. But so I guess that would be my question too, is how is it that we basically give away those kinds of powers for such an extended amount of time? 7 months is a really long time. So I guess my question would be, what kind of comparison is there to the provisions of a municipal declaration of emergency compared to the kind of provisions in the state's declaration?
Through the chair, this is Kate Vogel, if I can answer.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
All right, hearing nothing. Yep, okay. Thank you. So they're very similar in terms of the ability to access and spend money more freely than otherwise would happen. So I actually think it's a great parallel. I think the Assembly has significantly more ability to change what's happening in the scope of an emergency based on your ability to regularly meet, where the legislature is sort of, if you think about the mandates that are coming out of the state, they are getting they're issuing some very broad mandates where otherwise those wouldn't be unilateral decisions coming from the governor. Additionally, the money that's flowing from the feds, the 1.25 billion, is for the governor to spend, whereas normally appropriations flow obviously through the legislature. So I think that if anything, the legislature, which is gavelled out, has really handed the reins much more fully over to the governor than would be the case here, where the Assembly not only can end an emergency at any time and, as you point out, is able to meet quite regularly in addition to calling special sessions or emergency sessions when it wants to, and then additionally has that power to terminate any particular regulation or emergency order when it wants to.
Thank you. Crystal, do you have a follow-up to that? Okay. I also have Mr. Constant in the queue.
Yeah, thank you. One just slight note on what Ms. Vogel just said there. The legislature has not gavelled out yet, but when that comes, that will be the case. They're just on a recess, which is very strange. But so I have 2 points. One question. Well, both really questions, but the first one is to Jason. Jason, are you, as a team, the mayor, contemplating any amendments to the emergency regulations that are drafted that would be republished if this extension is granted, taking into account the considerations made or the conversations had with members?
Through the chair, Assemblymember Constant, yes, we are absolutely taking all of that information into account and balancing it against what we are being told by the medical experts and the medical community about what they see happening in terms of the spread of this virus in our community.
So those have come in the flavor of 2 different things that I've heard about, one being issues of the workplace, and one being issues of homelessness. And so rather than having those knockdown, drag out conversations, it would be great at some point before Tuesday's over to have a sense of where the administration would like to go with those considerations. And then the second question, and this is based on what I believe they're doing in Wasilla. In some ways, I share the concerns of my peers about the duration of the emergency. It seems like a long time, but also in other ways, I think it's actually smart for us to get out of the way and let this process be as orderly as possible under the executive. So it's kind of ambivalent and of two minds. But what they did in Wasilla, which I thought to be very smart, was their legislative body created and has placed on their regular agenda, maybe under special orders, I haven't seen the item itself, but where it's a resolution that terminates the emergency order that is introduced at every single meeting, and then they have a collective agreement that they'll vote it down until such a time as the emergency is over. So in that way, there's a check built into the system that doesn't have to be drafted in an emergency and introduced and passed, but instead it's just there. Is that something you guys have contemplated as a meaningful element to this process?
Through the chair, this is Jason again. This is I haven't looked at what their ordinance is, but I will certainly look at that and get back to you. And on your previous question, yes, it is our intention to let the assembly know what our thoughts are on the at least two different items that we have seen.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I missed a good chunk of the conversation, and that was because I was on the phone with representatives, and because I was very curious about this being extended to November 15th and with the parallels to the state. So I'll share a little bit of what I learned from the conversation from the representative that I talked with. And so there were two main reasons that the legislature made the decision that they made. First is that apparently the models that the governor and Dr. Zink have been looking at expect potentially a second surge of cases to come in the near future. Second was because of a much more constricted way for the legislature to act, they didn't know when they'd be able to reconvene. They're, like Mr. Constant said, they're in recess. So then I went into the sort of discussion of, well, if you guys had the ability to reconvene in a much more quicker fashion like we do here on the Assembly, would you have gone as far as November? And the initial reaction from the representative that I talked with was no. If we had the ability to reconvene as quickly as you all, we wouldn't go to November. We would have made it shorter than that. So that's just a comment. Question I do have though, and I think maybe Mr. Constant got into this a little bit, but specifically for me, the emergency order number 3, the hunker down order, does the administration know when they're going to provide us with a new version? Because for me, in order for me to vote on something like this, I would need to see a new version of what that hunker down order might look like before Tuesday. So hopefully that's something the administration can get to us.
Jason or Kate or anyone else from the administration, do you want to speak to that?
To the extent that we will have an updated order extending the EOs, we will certainly provide those before Tuesday.
Thank you. All right. Next in the queue, I have Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm unmuted this time. I guess I am really concerned about the 7 months extension. So I'm interested in possibly shortening that a bit. But there's a couple of concerns. One is, you know, we're supposed to have a weekly report, and I think that's been a little kind of sporadic. We've gotten maybe updates here or there. We certainly get questions answered if we know the right question to ask. But I can only think of one time that I ever got anything written that was kind of an update on where things are at and what kinds of things have been done. And certainly, you know, I've been watching all the mayor's press conferences, and those are definitely full of information. But in terms of any kind of a real report being submitted to the assembly, I can't say that I've seen anything that I would really qualify as being a weekly report. So I have concerns about whether or not that would be addressed and fixed during this extension period. Excuse me. But the other question that I have then is in regard to what a 7-month extension of a declaration basically does to employees that are considered non-essential. I guess I'd like maybe a little bit of information about whether or not there's been a conversation about how we begin to furlough people that are in positions for businesses or for entities within the Muni that we have basically closed down, or who really won't have a function while we're under this kind of a hunker down or lockdown or non-essential employment and things like that. So anyway, I don't know if anybody can answer that question, if there's been that kind of a conversation, but it seems to me that if we're going to go into an emergency situation for 7 more months, that we have some serious things to look at in terms of what we don't do anymore, what we don't pay for, what we do pay for. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair, this is Kate.
Yes.
If I can answer. Well, I only plan on answering a part of it, which is nothing in extending to November 15th is meant to imply, and in fact, we'd like to be really clear to the alternative that hunker down is lasting until November 15th. So were we saying that, I would agree that then we'd need to be sort of thinking about broadly what that sort of length of shutdown means, but that's not what we're saying. The emergency declaration itself allows for orders to come and go and change and respond to the nuance of the situation, and does for the whole length of time change some of our procurement procedures. That remains true, and the ability to reassign duties of municipal workers. So those things would remain in effect as part of the state of emergency. But this isn't intended to say all orders now would go until November 15th.
Can I follow up on that, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
But essentially, though, that's a very realistic possibility that we could be hunkering down in some way, shape, or form for many more weeks, maybe more months. And I guess my question is, at what point do you decide that, well, we just don't need these employees, or this particular municipal function isn't going to happen for a certain time? I certainly think if we're going to extend out an emergency declaration for 7 months, we ought to be thinking about what does that really look like if we're going to be confining or even redistributing some of our positions for other emergency functions. We probably ought to, I mean, at least as an assembly member, I would like to know what that does to the employee numbers, to the budget. I think I don't want to be in this limbo of unknown for 7 months and say, and then look back at the end of 7 months in terms of, oh, we should have taken care of this 2 months ago or 4 months ago or 6 months ago. And, but nobody ever made those decisions enough in advance that they were able to actually deal with an issue right up front and right away. So again, this idea of extending the declaration leaves a lot of things in limbo, and I don't want that to be what characterizes our whole world. I'd like to see what kind of decisions really should be made, like I said, especially in terms of how it impacts the budget. So
Mr.
just my
Schutte,
comment. So thank you.
thank you. Mr. Schutte, you wanted to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to offer some additional comments and colors to Ms. Vogel's response for Assemblymember Kennedy. As I understand your question about the longer term impacts to municipal functions, budgets, and departments, I can share you that some of that is already happening, and there are decisions that are being made within municipal departments that reorients the service delivery that we provide to the community, that reallocates the resources spent on staff, et cetera. And right now, because we are still in a ramp up period, both in the response to the pandemic and in the establishment of our emergency operations response team, it's definitely a little bit murky, but in essence, there are ways that a number of resources that would otherwise be idle are now actually valuable members of the emergency operations response effort, and have been reassigned in that capacity. Now, that won't ramp up forever, and as the emergency operations machine is built out, we will hit a point where then we have other municipal resources that aren't needed for that effort. Some of the departments have already begun planning, at least to the summer, to the middle point of the year, of how to adjust operations, staffing, and budgets to accommodate the new reality. So to the degree that we can provide the Assembly greater clarity into that, some of which I think will follow the first quarter budget revision discussion, that we'd be happy to do that. But I would like to reassure the Assembly that we are not living in the dark and not planning for the many different futures that we could see in 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel, you're in the queue.
Chair, can I just comment then on that? Just one final comment.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte. And I would just say henceforth the need for that weekly update. That would be very helpful to keep up to speed with those kinds of conversations and decisions. But thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I want to echo Ms. Kennedy's last comment there, very much so. I just let you know, I'm not comfortable with the 7-month extension. I understand the state may have done that. I just want to be really open and honest about that. I actually think that we need to look at this as an opportunity, kind of a hybrid of what Mr. Constance suggested, where we have the order or the declaration come before us in some kind of chunks of time where we can debate and have a conversation about what's happening, what's going on, and what the context is for the emergency declaration, taking into account what the current emergency orders are as well, because the emergency declaration doesn't happen in a bubble. It allows all these other things to happen. So right now I'm comfortable till our first meeting in June, which I think is June 3rd. It would give us the opportunity to talk about summer, what summer's going to look like, what is it going to mean. And I also think there's some danger in having the emergency declaration right now extend into the next school year without more up-to-date information, because I don't want the public assuming we won't be returning to school next fall, because I think it right now would be a real morale killer. So I guess I just want to throw out those cautions. I see why you've match the state, but based on what Mr. Rivera told us and some of these other factors, I'm probably going to be bringing an amendment for our first meeting in June. I just wanted to put that out there in case there's any response or anything anyone wanted to consider about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotel. Is there anyone from the administration who wants to speak to that? Otherwise, we have another person in the queue. Okay, Mr. Constant?
Thanks. And, I continue to be of a posture that for the purpose of certainty and planning and good order, that a good measure of time is wise, but also a solid check is important. And therefore, I would still continue to be bringing that conversation up about figuring out a way to put a regular order of business that would ask this question, but allow the mayor certainty and time to plan and execute. However, that's not my question. And I've been thinking about the emergency powers as they exist right now, and wondering, I asked Mr. Gates whether there was any special requirements in the code to provide to the assembly regular, semi-regular, monthly, 60-day reports on staffing changes under the emergency powers. Because currently we are provided with, under the code, it's required at the second regular meeting past the issuance of a contract outside of the procurement rules, a report on changes, contracts issued outside. But we don't really have, I don't believe, any kind of structured way to get a report on staffing changes that are implemented under the emergency powers. Now, I don't believe that at this time that's something that we have the power for, and it's something I would like to do with contemplation, not just roughshod over the breach. But it is something I'm thinking about, and it brings me to the question that I have, just for clarification's sake. Are we anticipating any layoffs of our staff in the municipality in the short to midterm because of all of these changes? Thank you.
Could someone from the administration speak to that?
So this is Chris Schutte, through the chair, Mr. Constant. I think circling back to my original comments back to Assemblymember Kennedy, at this time, we are not laying folks off. We are finding that there is a need for bodies like you wouldn't believe. And so as to the degree that we are able to, within the skill sets and CBAs of our workforce, we are finding ways to reassign people. I will add, though, that right now there are no new hires happening. So you will hear from some departments that there are vacancies that they were in the middle of filling when all of this happened. So to the extent that we are not filling certain positions, that is occurring. But at this time, there are not layoffs occurring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess 2 points. I think it was Ms. Vogel that brought up that just because we're extending this to November 15th does not mean that we're extending the various emergency orders to that time. And, I will just point out that while that might make sense to us in the room, I think to the broader public, there are going to be definite parallels between extending emergency powers and extending hunker down. I think that's what most folks in the broader public are going to see. So the more that we can be extremely clear about that, I think the better. I think I agree with Mr. Constant that we need to extend this to some point to allow for better planning purposes for the administration. I don't think it makes sense for us to ask the administration to plan in 2-week chunks. If there's some sort of sweet spot in between November and today, I think that makes more sense for us as a municipality versus what makes sense for the state government to do. I think there are distinct differences there. Second point is, I'm looking at a KTVA article that just came out like 20 minutes ago or so. And it reports from the mayor's community briefing that he gave at noon today, in which he stated, quote, "In all likelihood, we're looking at early May for the hunker down, but who knows, it's going to be based on data and medical advice." And so it appears that the administration is getting a fair amount of data and medical advice to make their decisions. I think to the degree that it is helpful for us as we make our decision, whatever the administration can share, I think the better for us, so that we can make wise and sound decisions for our constituents. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Is there anyone from the administration that wants to speak to that?
Mr. Chair, this is Jason. I would just say that to the extent that we have information from the medical community, we certainly try to get that out as quickly as possible, and either through the mayor's community updates or Bill Falsey's weekly EOC briefings on what we are seeing in terms of number of cases, what we're seeing in terms of flattening the curve. We will certainly continue to provide those updates. And if there's additional medical questions that the body does not think we are answering and they have questions about, we are certainly open to having those asked of us and see if we can't provide that type of information through those channels as well.
Thank you. I have Mr. Weddleton in the queue. Mr. Weddleton, I think you might be on mute. We can't hear you if you've been asking the question yet.
It's *6 to unmute if you're calling from a phone.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I was hitting my mute button. Sorry about that. Backing up a little bit to Meg's point on looking at the first meeting of June, and rather than make it the actual date of our meeting, I think we should have it a few days later. And our first meeting of June is the 2nd, and I'd recommend June 5th. Because now it's like it ends the day of our meeting. That would give a little bit of a buffer.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zalatel, you had a follow-up question?
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a request for the information that the current dates are being used, the medical modeling specifically. If you could either send a link or the actual information you're basing this off of, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Could someone in the administration speak to that?
Mr. Chair, this is Jason. We will certainly try to provide all of those links.
Okay. Actually, Dean, I had asked you to put an email, but do you want to respond to the code question and reporting question?
Yes. Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I don't know, or I'm not aware of anywhere in the code where it requires reporting in personnel or staffing changes in the, at least in terms of employees and departments and so forth. The only instances I am aware of is where there's confirmation from the assembly required. I will qualify that by saying I haven't thoroughly researched that, but I'm not aware of any provision. So if a legal employment law expert in legal is aware of something, I would defer to them, but I don't think there is any such reporting requirement. I would note, though, that the Assembly's required the regular reports from the administration, and if there's big employee changes and staffing changes, I imagine that might be, I mean, due to the emergency, I imagine that would be part of the mayor's reports.
Thank you, Dean. All right, I don't have anyone else in the queue. We have about 10 minutes left. Oh, I'm sorry. John, you have a question?
Yeah, if it's a little bit of a transition, I wanted to one thing of what Ms. Vogel said about, if we extend the proclamation, till whenever, that the assembly can meet anytime and cancel that, and then we can also go in and change emergency ordinances and the regulations. And my understanding is at our previous meeting, we had an ordinance that said we can go in and we can change regulations inside an ordinance. But I got an email today, so I'm confused, and Ms. Vogel's there and she can clarify. And this is regards to not much of a change, really, just an enhancement and clarification of an emergency order that's already in there. And it says, and this is quoting the email, my legal opinion that the use of emergency powers in this way by the Assembly is a violation of the Charter's explicit delegation of emergency powers to the mayor and is only strengthened since the last time we spoke about this. Well, the last time we spoke about this was when we did the ordinance that said we can go in and change regulations under an emergency ordinance. And so Ms. Vogel, can you clarify? I'm getting opposite interpretations here.
Absolutely. Through the chair, Mr. Whittleton. So the Assembly absolutely has the power to eliminate regulations and eliminate orders, but the Assembly did not grant itself authority to revise those regulations or those orders, like to write new ones. And that was a proposal at the last Assembly meeting that did not pass. It did not pass.
It was a proposal where we could modify one rather than completely get rid of it. So that was a little bit different.
Yes, that's correct. So maybe maybe I've said words that are confusing, but I think we're on the same page, which is, so there's not the ability to rewrite, but the Assembly certainly has the ability, and it's an enhanced ability now based on what passed last time, to not just end an emergency, but to end, have a finer tool to end specific orders, or even finer to end specific regulations.
But not make any to replace what we remove. That's
correct. That's my opinion. Right. That the emergency powers are vested in the mayor to make those types of orders. Now, there may be some orders which did not need to be an emergency order. They're just part of the ordinary power that the legislature has, that the Assembly, I'm thinking legislative powers, excuse me for speaking in terms of legislature, but that the Assembly in its legislative powers could do that might also be particularly wise in a time of emergency. And so it's not to say that the Assembly doesn't get to pass ordinances based on the situation that it's faced with. It's just that the emergency powers themselves and the types of orders that can only be issued in an emergency, that power has been vested by charter in the mayor. I don't know if I made things more clear or less clear with that explanation.
Mr. Gates, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, sure. So, from what Ms. Vogel said, and I respect and understand her position on what the charter and the code say on this subject of the mayor's emergency powers and the Assembly's role, and it makes good sense. It's got a bit of logic to it. I don't see that it's wrong, but I also have a different perspective, which I've stated at our March 31st meeting. I think that, and I guess I would state that because the nature of the COVID-19 public health emergency is such of a long duration, I don't think that anybody writing the charter really contemplated that. They were thinking of, a riot breaks out and you need some police powers to lock things down until the public peace is restored, short-term quick emergencies or an earthquake, So I think that just the nature of this long duration of this emergency is sort of brought this issue to light. So in my perspective, the Assembly still has legislative powers, and we have the power to pass emergency ordinances when there is an emergency. We have that definition in charter, and I don't see that that power given to the Assembly in charter is really abrogated by the part of the charter that says the mayor, I don't have it in front of me, but it's a may. It's phrased as a may. The mayor may have the power of police officer during an emergency. And from one perspective that Kate is taking, that's worded in a way that makes it exclusive. And to me, I think, well, we have emergency ordinance powers for the Assembly in another part of charter. We got to balance those. And again, it's also a separation of powers doctrine perspective that I'm taking in terms of, well, if the Assembly has legislative powers, they can operate in that sense when they're making an emergency ordinance that does something within legislative branches' powers. So making regulations and stuff like that, but maybe not directing where resources go, which is more of, or selling property and so forth, which is more of an executive function. So I did look at a legal treatise on municipal law, and it basically says that the arrangement for emergency powers is really up to the government and its rules and ordinances and its charter. And so there's not, I think, a general jurisprudence rule about emergency powers just being in a mayor. I didn't find, I looked through our charter meeting minutes too, and it wasn't helpful. There was a lot of talk about emergency ordinances, but not much about the mayor's exercise of emergency powers. Well, again, I think that Ms. Vogel's argument is good. I think mine is too, and I don't see a clear direction from some primary or secondary source law about which of us is right. I do note, though, that there was a practical matter. It's sort of it puts more cooks in the kitchen here, and it gets a little messier when we have both the mayor and the Assembly trying to make orders and so forth. So I would just say, because of that, don't exercise that power lightly. Otherwise, I think that I'm sort of at a stalemate with Ms. Vogel on that legal issue, and perhaps with more research that will be resolved.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Weddleton, you have a question?
Well, no more on that one. Did anyone want to follow up or move on briefly to something else? Or?
Mr. Chair, this is Jason. Can I just briefly respond?
Sure.
I actually pulled up the charter and the exact section, and I just want to clarify something that Dean said. Is the exact wording that he referenced said may. The charter actually does say the mayor has the power of a police officer, but may exercise it. So it's not that the charter says the mayor may have the power of a police officer. It actually does say that he does have it. So just a small clarification there.
Thank you, Mr. Bockenstead. Any other discussion on this particular issue before we go on to John's question? And I think that'll probably, yeah, go ahead. Who is that?
This is Kate.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, and further to that, so I again, we're talking about charter section 5.02. So the full paragraph, subsection D, is in case of emergency, the mayor has the power of a peace officer and may exercise that power as chief executive officer to prevent disorder and to preserve the public health. The Assembly, by resolution, may declare that the emergency no longer exists. So to me, it's not just speaking about the mayor's power and giving the power of a peace officer to the mayor. It's also stating what the Assembly's role is in that. We've tweaked it slightly in code here by saying this ability by resolution to declare that the emergency no longer exists should also be more fine-tuned to particular emergency orders or emergency regulations, because this is such a prolonged emergency. It's really demonstrating that there might be a difference between saying, is the emergency still happening versus is there still a need for hunker down, specifically as an example. And I view the fact that there's the ability to pass an ordinance in an emergency ordinance where you don't necessarily have the normal time between it. And so now we're talking the charter section 10.03 says, in case of an emergency, an ordinance may be introduced and adopted at the same meeting. An emergency ordinance shall contain a finding that an emergency exists and a statement of the facts constituting the emergency. And it then has a higher threshold for voting, but it doesn't give the assembly the powers of a peace officer. And so you put those two together and you really do have the police powers residing with the executive. And the assembly has the power when it's an emergency to use its ordinary powers, but faster, without notice, and with a higher voting threshold. So to me, the charter is pretty clear. And that's why it adds up to the emergency powers are vested in the mayor. And I understand advocating for the assembly and saying, you know, there's some ambiguity here, but I don't think that's the best reading of the law. I think, yes, agreed, it depends on what community you're in. Juneau has a different setup than Anchorage in terms of mayoral system and the power of the assembly. And there are communities that have weak mayors or strong mayors. The municipality chose a strong mayor model, and the charter chose for us who gets the emergency powers, and it gave it to the mayor with a very specific check and control over that power via the ability of the assembly to end the emergency, and now the enhanced ability to end particular orders or regulations. So that's why I come to the conclusion I do. I agree that there was room when people were drafting the charter to draft it differently. I just think the people of Anchorage made their choice, and that's the choice that we should be going forth with. And again, one of the problems with using an ambiguous power when it's an emergency power is you're then injecting legal uncertainty right into an emergency about which order is valid. And if the assembly has replaced one emergency order with another order of dubious validity, you then have a situation where there's maybe no order that is effective because the assembly gets to validly undo an emergency order or withdraw it or terminate it, but may not have the power to reissue one more to its liking. So I guess I echo Dean's words of caution on using ambiguous powers in a time of emergency where they might themselves not have legal validity if challenged in court.
Thank you, Ms. Vogel. Mr. Weddleton, and this will be our last question before we end the work session.
Yeah, I think kind of looking at something that Crystal said, you know, what kind of jobs have changed within the municipality? And I ask what, I'd like to see a list at some point, what activities does the city do that are not essential? You know, we closed the playground, so someone who might be directly working with playgrounds, maybe they got reassigned or something. But I think we had a specific comment from somebody who runs a nursery and was told, no, not essential. Are we still growing flowers? And I asked that for a friend. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. So I guess the question is, are we still growing flowers?
Well, that's one that jumps out. You know, we were told that no, that people can't do that, that businesses, that's not essential. They can't have people going to do that. So if we're doing it, and so I assume we're not, I'm sure those got shut down, but you know, are there other examples like that within city government that are non-essential services that were shut down?
Mr. Bockenstadt, do you want to speak to that? Or Chris Schutte?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Mr. Weddleton nailed it. We had a lot of our horticulture staff are reassigned.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I'm going to close this work session and look out for an email regarding the rescheduled work session on homelessness, And then, of course, we have our regular Tuesday night meeting. Again, I'm going to ask that everyone wear a mask to that meeting. And if you're coming to the meeting, of course, it will be great if you called in. And if for some reason you don't have a mask, or if you want an extra mask, please let me know, because I have access to many of them and I can get them to you. All right, with that, this work session is adjourned.